So, as you know, the United Nations is marking its 75th anniversary by hosting a global dialogue initiative titled UN75. These dialogues are aimed at gathering diverse perspectives and creative ideas on what is needed to address emerging risks and opportunities in our global society. TU Dublin is hosting dialogue range of themes. The Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Unit and the AIB Research Centre on Inclusive and Equitable Cultures are involved in hosting this dialogue, Inequality, Bridging the Divide, along with the one that we hosted yesterday, which was Women and Girls, Closing the Gender Gap. So for this particular dialogue, we are informed by the brief issued to us by the United Nations. And for that reason, we will be focusing on inequalities that are determined by gender, age, origin, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, class and religion. And these are inequalities that are also covered by TU Dublin's public sector duty obligations. We can also discuss the ways that TU Dublin is working and can work to combat inequalities within our organisation and in the global society. So leading our discussion today are our roundtable contributors, and I would like to take a moment to introduce these individually. We have Nadia Williams. Nadia, you might just like to make a little wave. Good woman. That's great. Thank you. We have Tom Cooney, who's a member of the lecturing staff. Thank you, Tom. Hamza Jones, who's here from the Student Union. Welcome, Hamza. And we will be joined later by Shalini Kuruguntia, who is another student, and by David Irwin, who is Head of School of Languages, Law and Social Sciences. And we are also joined by my colleague Caoimhe Kiernan, who has organised and all of this, and Noreen McNamara, who is prepared to step in my place if my broadband fails. So, welcome everyone, including all the people that are at this point listening in. What we're going to do is we're going to discuss 3 questions as a panel, and we will also encourage those people who are listening and attending to indicate with a little hand, this raise your hand function, if they would like to contribute, having heard the views of the contributors today. So first question, and this won't be anything new to those of you that we've been in touch with before. What do you think the international community should prioritise to help individuals suffering from inequalities recover better from the pandemic, given that this global COVID pandemic affects all of us? And how can TU Dublin contribute to this effort? So it'd be very interesting to hear the thoughts of the panelists on that question. I'm just wondering if anyone would like to lead off on some thoughts in relation to that.
I'll make a start, Yvonne, if you wish.
Thanks, Tom.
I've actually just spent the last 3.5 hours on a conference call, or just a conference actually, being hosted by the Department of Enterprise on their national economic plan, and it was broken into different sessions, and I was in the session on equality in terms of economic recovery. And the reason I've an interest in that area is that my main research interest is minority and disadvantaged communities, and particularly entrepreneurship in those communities. But I've also recently published a report with the Open Doors Initiative called Supporting Marginalized Communities into Employment. And what's really evident, right, is that the pandemic is disproportionately affecting people from marginalized and disadvantaged communities. There's lots of evidence on that. And equally, there was lots of evidence with regard to that from the last recession. But I think what a lot of people don't appreciate or recognize is that not only are they disadvantaged in terms of more likely to become employed because of the pandemic, but it's actually going to take them much longer to become employed afterwards. And they are in greater danger of long-term. And what I found from the report that I wrote last month was that there's lots and lots of initiatives out there around supporting people from marginalized communities into employment. And there's lots of programs, there's lots of organizations, there's lots of welfare benefit systems, but it's incredibly complex in terms of trying to understand it. And even the people within the system don't get it. And if we are to build pathways to employment for marginalized communities, then we need to make those pathways visible. We need to ensure that not only can the user or the potential user see the pathway, but the providers or the support agents working with them can also see them. So that's the first point I'd make, that pathways, that if we're going to develop them, they got to be visible to all and not complicated or complex, as is currently the situation. I think the second thing I would say then around that, and this takes us into maybe more international understanding, but I think we got to change the language around what we're talking about here, because anytime I look at or talk with people about marginalized communities and disadvantaged communities, it's always about how do we solve the problem. Okay, it's seen as a social problem and a social issue, and and they're costing us money and all the rest, right? And I think we got to change that language to seeing people from marginalized communities as an economic opportunity, because we know from the research that if there's greater gender diversity in boardrooms, then companies perform better in many different ways. Okay, not just financially, right, but in many different ways, and in terms of the way in which the company operates and its value system and so forth. But if boardrooms and organizations and employees within those organizations were more diverse, then I think there would be greater economic, personal and social value for those organizations and society around them. So we've got to change the language from problem to opportunity. And in terms of language, I read a book some time ago by Timothy Shriver, who founded the Special Olympics. Well, sorry, he didn't found it, it was his mother founded it. He's the CEO of the Special Olympics worldwide. And Timothy Shriver talked about diffability. Okay, that it's people of different abilities, and instead of disability, and that's part of the language I think that we need to think about, that people from all communities, from all parts of society, have different abilities to which they can contribute to the well-being of our society. So in terms of what do you think the international community should prioritize, I'm saying two things, I suppose, Yvonne. I'm saying it's about creating clear pathways, and it's about changing the language of the discussion that we're having. And in terms of what we can do, I think it's within the remit of all of us. It's within the power of all of us that are or role we have in TU Dublin, that we educate, not educate, but we have a value system that we share with others, including students, around this language and about pathways. And for like simple things like this year, for the first time, shame on me, but for the first time, all of my students who are creating, who are on the New Venture Creation Programme, their business idea must be related to one of the 17, UN SDGs. Okay, so it must contribute to solving one of those problems or addressing one of those areas. Now, that's a simple way within a classroom of getting students thinking about the SDGs. Okay, and equally, all of the project work that they're doing is around charities and around social enterprises. So they're running charity events. They're doing consultancy projects for social enterprises. So in many different ways, we can create experiential learning opportunities by engaging with communities. We can get them thinking about the UN SDGs. We can get them thinking about what equality really means through discussions in any subject. It doesn't have to be a subject around equality. This transcends everything that we do. Okay. So I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I think those thoughts are a huge contribution to opening up our debate here, and I think we'll be coming back to them. And what's really welcome is the clarity of thought that you bring to all of this, and some of the points that you made resonate, in fact, with yesterday's dialogue around language, around changing the language. But the issue around making pathways visible and easy to navigate is another very critical point as well. Can I bring some of our other panelists or contributors in, if you would like to respond to this question, the first question around what should be prioritized to help individuals suffering from inequalities recover better from the pandemic, and what can we do? Any further thoughts around all of that? So Nadia, yes, please.
My specialism is actually in sustainable transport and media related to sustainable transport. It's very much in how there is a type of inequality happening on the road. So I'm very interested in inequality generally. I wonder, when you said, Thomas, should our focus shift? If there isn't an argument also to be made to not only always focus on those from inequality, from those benefiting from inequality. I know that any attempt to bring more equality about is very often, almost as a rule, perceived as some kind of assault by those who are benefiting, those who have more. So, for instance, there is technology available to limit speed on vehicles, and one could save thousands of lives if you were to implement it. However, there is a lobbying group with the power to prevent this being implemented across the EU. So I give that as an example because that's from my field of specialism. The point that I'm making is, if we shift focus, is there not an argument to be made that some of that focus must also be on reducing the power of the privileged to the efforts to increase equality? And that's it. That's my point.
Really interesting point, Nadia, I must say. I mean, you're also, I think I can infer from you saying that, in a way, to some extent, equality shouldn't be a zero-sum game. It should be something that everybody collectively benefits from. And it also, your other point is that for some people, for reducing the power of some people is necessary to share the power with other people. So in a way, what it's about is a redistribution of power, a more equitable redistribution of power, and in order for the collective good to be achieved.
Yeah, and it's also an awareness that people with a platform, people with the ability to have their voices heard, often are the privileged. So one needs to be mindful if one thinks in terms of the UN, perhaps just more mindfulness that those are the voices that they'll hear, and to just be aware that they might not be hearing from people who are on the suffering side, even though we're always talking about those suffering and we're always talking about those who are underprivileged. Is there not a danger that we are always talking about and never bringing people to the table to actually put their own case? It's a sort of a diminishment there, and perhaps a form of inequality, because there is not an equal platform and an equal voice there.
A very good point, Nadia, and I see Hamza nodding in agreement with these points, and also chiming in with Tom. So Hamza, would you like to contribute to this discussion?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I agree with both Thomas and Nadia with their points that they brought up. I'd probably just go back with like the point of inequality with like work. I'd say like minority groups trying to find like work out there, like especially with the pandemic now, like there's lots of jobs lost and all that going on now. But like even before the pandemic, I feel like people of color always found it hard to kind of find work, even if it was part-time or even after college kind of a thing, because like there is that inequality there. Like even when I be just sometimes like when like a few years back or even now, when I just be sitting on my bed just thinking, like when I have gone abroad, I have seen it, but like kind of here, like when was the last time I went to Tesco and I saw a person of color on the tills? When was the last time I went to Dunstairs and I saw person of color, or even a Muslim person with like a hijab on the tills or working in the shop? Well, there is like a few coming in now here and there, but like there isn't that many. So like it is kind of like when I feel like people of color applying for jobs are kind of like least kind of like treated like you won't kind of get the job unless like there's kind of a role going for that. Like even like I know like many people of color might not want to go for the job, but like I've not seen like a person of color, like a Gardaí or someone like a person of color, like whereas in America you'll see like a black cop, or like in the UK you'll see like a black policeman, but like over here I don't see any person of color like in the Gardaí or like anyone there. So that's just something I've been thinking of, and kind of inequality gap in there in that sense. So I don't know if anyone else would like to do it.
A very, very important, significant and timely point, Hamza, and also points to the significance of role models, because the old adage, you cannot be what you cannot see, feeds into that as well. And if one cannot see oneself reflected in a particular workplace or in a profession or in a decision-making position or whatever, then how can one ever think that one can aspire to being in that place? Of course, that's all overlain on top of the deeper is the biases against when it comes to employment. These deep biases that are either acknowledged or unacknowledged in terms of recruitment practices, in terms of expectations of who is the right person to fill this role. And often it's centered on very superficial judgments rather than a deeper analysis of the requirements and the person specification. So any further thoughts on this question from our panelists. Noreen, Noreen, would you like to come in?
David has joined us. I don't know if David, do you want to? It's the first question.
You're very welcome, David. We are just teasing out the first question, but if you've just joined us, you might want to catch your breath for a minute, David. So if anybody else would like to just contribute to this general discussion around what the international community should prioritise to help individuals suffering from inequalities recover better from the pandemic, and how can TU Dublin contribute to this effort? So that's where we are at the moment, and we have a wide range of thoughts on the matter. I'm sure maybe some of our participants who are listening in may also wish to say something.
Yvonne, if I could just very briefly just thank you for hosting this meeting, and just to let you know, I'm actually only popping in and popping out on this one because I've actually 4 things happening concurrently at the moment. So I just want to thank you and to thank all the participants in such numbers. You know, I think it's very impressive, and I'm delighted that you're actually all going to contribute so that your voice and TU's voice in this particular and important topic is registered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We appreciate that indeed, and we're all very envious of your lovely background, your lovely bookshelves there.
Oh, that it were real.
Okay, so we have a lot of thoughts around all of that, and I think there's a big overlap between the point earlier made by Tom around economic opportunity rather than social problem as the approach. So the approach being a positive opportunity-based and opportunity-led approach, which I think if that were infused into all policies and all practices would in fact be a real game changer, would really transform the landscape. And that speaks again to Nadia's point about the redistribution of power and the listening to the people for whom these policies are meant to be designed or directed. So working with rather than speaking at as the approach. And very specifically then relating to the points that Hamza has made around people of colour, which absolutely feeds into all of those kinds of questions. So maybe we will move on to question 2 now. And this is a show of hands that everybody participating here is invited to show. And Caoimhe, I think you're going to keep track on how many people can show.
I will indeed.
Yeah. So, so the question is for the show of hands, and it'll be in three parts. Okay. Do you think people suffering from inequality in 2045 will be better off than, worse off than, or about the same as today? That's the first part. And then the second part will be why. But first of all, let's try and get the show of hands. So I'll go with all those thinking that people suffering from inequality in 2045 will be better off than they are today. So show of hands on that one. Okay, I think we have 2, maybe 3 people saying that they will be better off. Okay, so then the next choice, the second choice, do you think people suffering from inequality in 2045 will be worse off than they are today? Do you think? So there seems to be a lot of people going for that. Caoimhe, have you got any sort of running tally there on that one?
We had 3 for better off, 6 for worse off.
And then about the same. So do you think people suffering from inequality in 2045 will be about the same as today? So if you agree with that, maybe just raise your hand here. I think we have about 4 so far that I can see. Maybe 5 at this stage. 6. So great. Okay, so it seems that that people, the majority of our group anyway, feel that when we get to 2045, the people suffering inequality at that point will be about the same as today, which I'm afraid it gives us a big task and shows the size of the issue to be tackled, because in 2045 we're all going to be at different phases of our lives, and one would hope that over that time people would have we would have had a more egalitarian world. We're always hoping that that's the case, but there's a lot of work to be done to achieve it. And I'd just like to ask our contributors now, why did you give the answer that you gave? Because different people gave different answers. So would anybody like to offer why they gave that answer? No. I see Fernanda. Would you like to make a point here?
Yes, hi, how are you? My name is Fernanda. I'm a senior research assistant at the School of Hospitality Management and Tourism. I'm Brazilian, but I'm living in Ireland for 4 years now. I'm a historian as well, so when I think about the pandemic, I think in historical ways, and I was thinking about this answer. First, I thought it was going to be the same because yesterday at the same, when you had this meeting, it was asked about gender gap, and all I'm reading about is that gender gap will remain the same if nothing is done now. But when I think about inequality, there are so many issues related to inequality that have not already been solved, and I think the pandemic just worsened it. So I can't have a positive perspective for the future if everything is not discussed now. I think today and the years that come from today are the time for us to discuss it deeply and see all the things that are making people live in an equal form in the world. So thinking about it, that's why I gave the answer today. Gender gap, I think, is going to stay the same if nothing is done, but I think there is a perspective that might change because it is in the agenda, the UN agenda, and there are other agendas in the world. But inequality, I think there are much deeper issues to be discussed. So that's why I gave the answer. I hope it helps. Just a point of view.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. It certainly does. I have 2 more people indicating. One is, so I'll take them in the order I see, Mary Farrell and then Sarah Clavero. So Mary, I'd like to bring you in now. Mary, you're muted.
So my worry is that as a result, the economic results of the pandemic will focus mainly on trying to get our economy back on track, and gender inequality will come way down the ladder of importance. For me, that I think in my own industry, I can see that happening already, and I think unless there are sort of very strong vocal bodies like the UN that make it a priority, even when we address our economic crisis that we may have after the pandemic, ultimately gender inequality will stay down the order of importance. So I think we need to, if we're trying to be positive about it, we have to it has to be pushed along through our change in our, if we're going to develop our economy after the pandemic, it has to be a completely within the whole policy change for the development of the economy. Otherwise, we're going to struggle to keep it on the agenda, I think.
Yvonne, can I comment on that?
Yes, indeed you can. And then I'll let Sarah in after your comment. Yeah,
because I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that depends on how governments address it. Because, like I say, I spent the last 3.5 hours in a meeting with the Department of Enterprise, on the development of National Economic Plan, and participating in that was Minister Humphreys and and Tánaiste Bhreagchar, and there was a deep commitment across people participating that the pandemic is an opportunity to reset our world, or reset the way we think about our country. So yes, on the one hand, I would agree that economic recovery is going to be critical, but how we do it, I think, can be reimagined. And there was very strong contributions within that discussion around ensuring that there is equality and inclusion in that economic recovery plan. And it wasn't, we said, just around gender or particular marginalized groups, but it included like regions and sectors, and how can we really be equitable. And so I think this comes back to being positive rather than kind of positive opportunity, and I think if the goodwill is there, it can happen. What I'm concerned about, I actually voted for it being relatively the same, because I don't think there's enough goodwill there to make that happen. You look at the rise of President Trump in America, Boris Johnson in the UK, and far right-wing groups across Europe. That's not going to change within 25 years, would be my concern. And we're missing the visionary leaders like Obama or other people like that who are much more inclusive, like some Nelson Mandela and people like that. And so I don't think we have enough global leaders at this time who are visionary enough to be inclusive, to get the job done within 25 years. Because if I think back 25 years ago, it was only 1995. Mm-hmm. For those of you of a younger generation, those 25 years have flown. And I'm not sure inequality in a global scale has changed. Individuals will have changed, but in terms of the global population, has there been a significant change in 25 years? I don't think so. But I am hoping if we go back another 25 years before that, maybe to 1970 and 1960s, and say, has the world changed between the 1960s and now? Yes, it has, and I think it's far more equitable now than it was then. I just can't see it happening within a 25-year period, because I don't think the goodwill or the will of the politicians is there to make it happen.
In the international community, yeah.
In the international community.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I want to bring a couple of other people in now, Sarah and Nadia. So Sarah first.
Yeah, hello everybody. I am a bit pessimistic about equality improving by then. If you look at trends from the 60s, my specialism is on gender equality and socioeconomic inequalities. On socioeconomic inequalities, you see that the inequalities are broadening, and I don't see any, even in the social sciences, interest in socioeconomic inequalities. I think they are kind of, I mean, from my point of view, they are not being put on the table as they should. And then on gender inequalities, what we have seen in the feminist movement and feminist scholarship, it's a big backlash, and also there are more people you see in surveys, social surveys, that the idea that gender equality is not an issue anymore because it's something that it has been achieved. Funding is being cut for it, and so I don't know. I'm not very. If you see look at trends, and also you look at the political climate worldwide, I'm a bit pessimistic to that a complete change is going to happen, especially during the pandemic, that we are seeing that gender equality is suffering, and socioeconomic inequality as well, a lot, yeah, and other inequalities, of course.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Nadia. The floor is yours.
I think another thing that we need to take into consideration, and which makes me a little bit pessimistic, although I have to say things can go anywhere depending on what we do now. I think we need to take into consideration the effect of fear. I believe that the sort of lurch towards authoritarianism, if you will, as you mentioned, in the form of Trump and Johnson, could have something to do with an increase of fear. We are increasingly aware that the climate crisis is an existential threat, and pollution, and our tendency, I think, is to show hostility towards people who are other, who we somehow perceive as not being the in-group. And that is one of the things that makes me pessimistic, is we need to address that fear, because things like pandemics and natural disasters are set to become more frequent. When we feel threatened like that, and I was actually looking for this quote in my work in progress, when people's attention is drawn to contemplating death, their own mortality, they show a tendency to become hostile to those who challenge their worldviews. And when you are different, when you live differently, you can't help but challenge others' worldviews. So my point is, I think fear of the other might exacerbate inequality and increase resistance to efforts to address inequality, and that it should be taken into account in our efforts to, address inequality and, basically create a better world for I'm at risk of sounding a bit cliched saying that, but that's more or less what it's about. Mm-hmm. So that's my point. It's just we need to think of fear and its role in actually entrenching inequality and increasing resistance to efforts to address it.
Very well, a point very well made, Nadia, and also a point that is easily played upon by people who are seeking to take advantage of the moment, and so the importance of paying attention to the affective world, to the world of emotion that we live in, is in fact a very important one, and challenge and bringing our thoughts to bear on the challenges that face us in a way that is not motivated by fear, but it is motivated by collective action, by problem solving, by a desire to see the human race continue and flourish, which is the big problem that we're facing. Now, I have two people indicating. One is Nadia, and then I wasn't sure, Mary, if you had a legacy hand up or if you wanted to come back in again. That wasn't clear.
No, I'm okay at the moment, thanks.
All right. So Nadia.
Sorry, no, that was the point that I wanted to make, that I just...
Oh, sorry.
It's grand, no worries.
Okay. Okay. Hamza, is there any reflection that you would like to contribute to this line of the discussion?
Yeah, so 25 years from here, I'm not too sure what, sometimes I'm like, it could be better, and then sometimes I think it could be the same. But everything that happened even during the summer, the BLM movement, everyone was sharing stuff on Instagram and social media, and it was going all up, and people we were like, oh, this is actually happening, and we're kind of teaching people, and people are using their white privileges and kind of sharing stories and stuff. But then if you look at the other side then as well, when you look at comments and you see racial comments happening, and you're like, oh, we're bound, is it changing, is it not changing? And you're just kind of stuck between the middle, do people want this? And even when the BLM protesting was happening, people are like commenting, well, like, oh, COVID is happening and you're not following guidelines, like, and I'd say like some people were like saying like distance and stuff, but and then like the mass protesters were happening, like they were giving abuse, but like I don't think they were giving like much abuse as we were giving. They were like, go back to your country kind of a thing, whereas like the mass protesters like, oh, this is social distancing kind of a thing, and it was kind of like giving out but not giving out the way they were giving out to like the BLM protests. So I'm like, you can't be better off, and then sometimes I'm like, it's gonna stay the same kind of a thing. I'm not too sure, but yeah, that's me. So I'm kind of stuck between the two.
Indeed, Hamza, and you really do bring out the challenge in having that kind of a conversation as a society in a way that's constructive rather than that sets people up in opposition to one another, that one inequality is greater than another inequality or more important, or that because there is one context that another context can't happen. And of course, as we all know, all of these issues intersect with one another and are perpetuated and exaggerated by the current COVID pandemic, and as Tom alluded to earlier, by the economic recession that preceded it, because many people were just beginning to find their feet 10 years after the recession when COVID hit. So this COVID context is not a leveler. This COVID context, in fact, accentuates privilege and accentuates marginality, for sure. So let's turn to our final question here. Our final thought piece which is, what do you most want to see in relation to the people suffering from inequality in the year 2045, when the UN will turn 100? Now, there are sub-questions in all of that. We mightn't get a chance to go to them, but I think that if we had a vision for what it is we wanted to see by 2045 and addressing inequalities, what would it be? Would we be able to sum it up in a few words each, by any chance? So who'd like to kick off on that? Do I get a sense that Nadia is formulating some thoughts?
I'm happy to go first. I am personally, and I have to just emphasize again, like my specialism is sustainable transport, and although I look at inequality in the inequality's role in that, and you know, social dominance, I'm not a specialist. I am a fan of the concept of universal basic income, because I believe as we go into the future, there will be a lot of people who cannot find work through no fault of their own. The increased development of technology and so on will simply make some people's work obsolete, and it's not going to be their fault. However, I understand it is a controversial concept, and I am not an economist. I don't know what its prospect is to work. I therefore would say my second prize would be a living wage for everyone. I am also a fan of quotas because I feel that you can't tell people who have power, like, it is your job to now redistribute that power and give it to others. I think quotas work. I think they've been shown to work. And as you've mentioned, it has been shown so many times that when you have more diversity, it is actually a benefit. Businesses and societies generally do better when more diverse people participate, people from all kinds of backgrounds, genders, cultures, whatever. So I would love in the future for quotas to be a norm, not something unusual or strange, and for the benefit of diversity to be something everybody is aware of. And then I think the second most important thing is a living wage for everyone. Just because you are talented in something that doesn't pay a fortune, like my childhood education, And I've been trying to off it for years because I know how poorly it pays. But why? Why should she, if she goes to work in daycare, be earning less than her partner who is a computer science major? Why? Does he work harder than her? No. Well, if you work, you should be able to live with dignity. So I would say those are the two major things that I would hope to see in the future and that I think are keys to reducing inequality: a living wage and quotas. That's my piece.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you. Very, very clear, very precise, and very areas that we can certainly talk about for a long period of time. Aidan Carty is attending this, and Aidan, you indicated that you had some thoughts. So
yes, thank you so much for organising this. It's really interesting. This is arguably a very obvious point to make, but I think sometimes the risk is that we fall into the trap of equality becoming something that we do to people rather than with people. So, like I said, possibly a very obvious point to make, but I think we really need to work on including people who are marginalised in the decision-making process and the conversations that we have with them. I'm a psychologist. I manage a research centre on the Blanchardstown campus of TU Dublin. My main focus is mental health. So, for example, Nadia, you were talking about fear, and I think a lot of the time what can happen is people develop what we psychologists call learned helplessness, where you start essentially to give up. If you give somebody a negative message enough times and for long enough, they're likely to start believing it and to start giving up and thinking, what's the point? Nothing is going to change and nobody really wants to listen to me anyway. And coupled with the fact that what often happens in relation to the point that you were making, Hamza, is that sometimes I think people who have a minority status are not actually listened to. So there are solutions that are put forward, but when you're not part of the conversation, that, in terms of developing them, they're not the solutions that you're looking for. So I think what we really need to do at a basic level is engage in a dialogue with people who have a minority status and simply ask, what would you like us to do for you? And include them in that conversation so it becomes something that we do with you, not to you.
Aidan, thank you very much for that contribution. I think that brings a lot of the threads of what some of our earlier thoughts that were presented, brings them together very, very nicely. Thank you. Is there anybody else, especially from our attendee group, who have not spoken yet? If you would like to have your point on the table, you're more than welcome to contribute now, because Caoimhe, I have a funny feeling that we may be coming to the close of this session fairly soon. Is that right?
Yeah, we have another few minutes for any further kind of points or questions, but yeah, we'll be finishing up fairly soon.
Yeah. So, any other thoughts?
Yeah, if you don't mind, Yvonne, while we're waiting for other contributors, I suppose the question is, like, what can the UN do? And for me, as I don't see the political leadership there at the moment for consensus. So therefore, what can the UN do without consensus? And I think if we're looking at solving the issue of inequality and coming back to previous points that were made by people, kind of identifying, seeing hope for themselves and find pathways for themselves, it all comes down to education. Well, not all comes down to education, but education is a hugely important part of this, right? And for me, to me, if people who are better educated can see, are more likely to have more economic opportunities, are more likely to see social injustices, are more likely to be educated or understand how they can change that. And so if we want to change the world, I think it's got to be, education's got to be critical. But also within education, I'd like to see, our young people educated about actually not just young young people, but everybody, educated about the value of the UN. You know, to paraphrase, you know, the life of Brian, like, what has the UN ever done for me? And I think, you know, that's a problem. We need the UN to come out and educate us more clearly and educate young people more clearly about the value that it brings to the world and about what it does for the world. We got 17, you know, sustainable development goals, which are really clear. Okay, let's use that as our starting point in which to educate people about the value of the UN and its work across the globe and how it does make a difference when there is consensus, when there is, you know, a collaboration across communities and from all sectors of society. And so that's the first point. And then the second point, really briefly, is that if we're talking about education as a key, then TU Dublin has a critical role. And I think I would like to see, you know, TU Dublin go kind of, you know, it's got great roots in its history in terms of, you know, being, you know, helping local communities in terms of the apprenticeships, in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of disadvantaged communities and elsewhere. We've got a long history of being open, you know, when other universities were very closed. And, you know, that value system that we have, I think that should be really, really strong within our new university system. I think it should be, you know, something we live by and who we are. I think we should be using it to sell, you know, as to why people should come to us, because this is who we are and this is our value system. And then within our teaching and within our actions, we are truly inclusive. So we live by what we talk about. So we set an example, but I think the UN needs to kind of focus on education, both of itself and educating young people around the world about their rights and about a way forward for economic opportunity.
Thank you, Tom. Indeed, these are big questions, and also the role that TU Dublin can play in it is really very important. And indeed, all of us who are in TU Dublin, we have our own individual roles to play in that regard as well, no matter what piece of TU Dublin we come from. And the Sustainable Development Goals are really a really powerful framework for bringing around equality in the world. And I think TU Dublin has its role in that, because TU Dublin is founded not just on all the Sustainable Development Goals, but particularly on Goal 4 in terms of access to education for all, inclusive education, and Goal 5, which is gender equality. So I think there are lots of threads that we can pick up in relation to all of that in our own work in TU Dublin. So maybe what we can do is draw this conversation to a conclusion at this point in time. My sincere thanks to Nadia, to Thomas, to Hamza for leading this particular conversation today. My indebtedness goes to Caoimhe, who has put both of the dialogues together. Thank you very much, Caoimhe. We are all appreciative of the work that you have done. And thank you to everybody for participating and being willing to take time out of your very busy day to come and have a conversation that has TU Dublin implications, but has also a contribution to make to the international world. Before we leave,